Every cinephile has a moment when movies stop being entertainment and kind of start becoming a language, sort of a private vocabulary through which you understand the world. Sometimes this moment happens in a dark theater, sometimes during a midnight screening with friends, and it can even sneak up on you during a conversation you didn't expect to matter. What's funny is how rarely films try to capture that transformation honesty. Too often, you find them to be flattened into nostalgia or even romanticized into myth. But every so often, you stumble upon a film that remembers the small beginnings, the friendships, the disagreements, the messy collaborations that make young artists feel like they're inventing something, even when they themselves aren't sure what that something is yet. In watching Richard Linklater's latest, I really felt that spark, the tentative, chaotic excitement of discovering cinema, not as a field, but as a home. But what did I exactly feel when I watched this movie? Well, that's what I'm gonna talk about in today's episode. I'm Pedro from Vinyl N Celluloid, and this is my review of Nouvelle Vague. Now, there's an ongoing ritual in contemporary film culture, the yearly declaration that cinema is on life support or actually dead. The reasons are multiple and rotate: declining attendances, the dominance of streaming, the fatigue of the franchise treadmill, but the essence remains the same. These eulogies have become so routine that they almost overshadow the quieter truth that every past period of uncertainty has sparked reinvention. And that the late 1950s were no different. Europe's traditional filmmaking structures were calcifying, audiences were shifting, and the once reliable formulas felt increasingly out of touch. Amid this stagnation, a group of young critics in Paris began questioning every assumption they'd inherited. They admired classical filmmakers but felt suffocated by their rules. Their essays read like manifestos, and their screenings like battlegrounds. Richard Linklater's Nouvelle Vague captures this moment of agitation with a rare lightness. Rather than treating the French New Wave as a chapter already carved in stone, he revisits the moment before it cohered, when it was still just an ongoing cluster of voices testing boundaries, uncertain of how far they could push. And yes, as you may have guessed it, this movie does have some biographical components to it. However, the title doesn't dramatize a legend in progress. It places us, the audience, beside people who were still figuring themselves out. What's remarkable is how unintentionally the filmmaker aligned that creative restlessness with our current moment. The film suggests that renewal comes not from grand gestures, but from small acts of defiance, conversations, improvisations, and the willingness to abandon safety. And in a time shaped by algorithms and risk management, that perspective feels unusually bracing. In this context, Nouvelle Vague reminds us that cinema has been declared dead before. It survived because enough people refused to believe it. But before I continue to go wax poetic on this title and take a deeper dive into why this movie works so well, let's go over the usual recap section, shall we? Set in late 1950s Paris, Nouvelle Vague follows a circle of aspiring filmmakers and critics, Godard, Truffaut, Chabrol, Rohmer, and others, orbiting the Cahiers du cinéma scene as they drift between screenings, cramped apartments, editorial meetings, and makeshift film shoots. The film starts by tracking their daily rhythms, debates over American genre movies, improvised rehearsals, and the messy juggling act between passion projects and low-paying jobs. But beyond this loose spine of story, there's a core theme centered around Godard's earlier attempts to shape what would become the seminal movie Breathless. Instead of following a traditional biographical arc, the movie adopts a semi-verite structure where conversations blur into practice runs, and the mechanisms of filmmaking appear as fragmentary experiments rather than fully polished scenes. The iconic French filmmaker is constantly at odds with his colleagues, harboring a certain resentment around the fact that he is the last one of his cohort to actually helm a full-length feature. Underneath this palpable tension lies the fear that these filmmakers' ideas won't cohere into anything meaningful. The obstacles are many, coming from budget constraints, fragile confidence, and the simple fact that innovation rarely looks promising whilst it's still in progress. And by the time we, the audience, are treated to a rough assembly of Breathless, Nouvelle Vague has already captured the uncertain and unglamorous stretch that usually precede a cultural shift, a period defined less by triumph than by the stubborn refusal to repeat the past. Now, as you can tell, I felt fully engaged with this movie. The irony that this title found a home in the iconic streaming that's partially responsible for the decimation of the theatrical experience was not lost on me. But as I choose to see the glass half full, I believe that this movie may very well play a role in inspiring Netflix's existing audience to go a step beyond the streamer's immediate offer and actually take a deep dive into less conventional and commercial titles. Getting back to Richard Linklater's latest title, I think what really makes Nouvelle Vague so refreshing is its refusal to treat cinema's past as a sacred terrain. Instead of bowing to the mythology surrounding the French New Wave, director Richard Linklater approaches it as something open and still resonant, an unfinished conversation rather than a sealed chapter. The film recognizes the New Wave's impact, but it doesn't present its key players, such as Godard, Truffaut, or their peers, as fully formed auteurs. Instead, it shows them as young cinephiles who adored movies intensely enough to challenge them. Their film knowledge is presented not as gatekeeping, but as exuberance, a sense that cinema is pliable, alive, and waiting to be reshaped. By focusing on the atmosphere that preceded the breakthroughs, Nouvelle Vague offers a different kind of homage. The filmmaker avoids dramatic reenactments of famous anecdotes, but still treats us, the informed audience, to a decent amount of Easter eggs. Instead, he rebuilds the environment that allowed experimentation to flourish. The smoky bars, cramped editing rooms, frantic phone calls to half-interested producers, and feverish debates that incubated their ideas. It's a portrait of artistic thirst rather than creative certainty. The love of film here isn't nostalgic, it's tactile, full of imperfections and contradictions that fuel the shift that artists themselves didn't fully understand at the time. The director's reverence emerges not from imitation, but from attention, to process, to friendship, and to the shared desire to push cinema somewhere unfamiliar. And by framing the era as a vibrant swirl of influences and uncertainties, the movie honors history not by preserving it in amber, but by reminding us why it mattered in the first place. Overall, it celebrates the impulse that keeps art and cinema moving decade after decade. And speaking of impulses, we find in this 2025 release another example of the director's trademarks. Those of you familiar with Linklater's filmography know that one of his most distinctive gifts is the director's ability to capture people in the act of becoming themselves. We saw this in the Before trilogy, Dazed and Confused, and even Boyhood. With Nouvelle Vague, the director brings that sensibility to a period often reduced to theory and manifestos, infusing it with warmth, spontaneity, and humor. And because of this, the film feels lived in. We follow the young artists through all their usual hangout places, something that fully embodies Linklater's brand of hangout movies, where idle talks suddenly turn into inspiration. Arguments erupt and dissolve, friendships shift shape. The everyday becomes meaningful because these characters are constantly testing their limits and each other. And as per usual, the ensemble chemistry is effortless. Godard's abruptness, Truffaut's idealism, Chabrol's slight charm, and Rohmer's observational calm play off each other in ways that feel neither improvised nor scripted, but somewhere in between, which is exactly the area in which the filmmaker thrives. Now, this isn't exclusive to the filmmaker's side and actually extends to the French filmmaker's relationship with his cast and technical team. And through it all, Linklater preserves the vulnerability beneath the banter. Because like anyone with a creative impetus, these characters worry about whether they have something original to say, whether they can afford to keep pursuing this path, and most importantly, whether they belong in the world they idealize so passionately. These hangout sequences do more than entertain, they are the emotional backbone of the film. There's mostly joy here, but also a gentle ache, the awareness that such periods of life are brief and rarely recognized until they're gone. Still, underneath its relaxed mood, Nouvelle Vague operates as a thoughtful exploration of how artists find direction. Richard Linklater uses the setting not merely to dramatize cinematic history, but to examine the personal battles that accompany creation: hesitation, rivalry, bursts of insight, and the fear of never measuring up to one's influences. The film's rich illusions, be that visual, structural, and verbal, enrich its perspective without overwhelming it. The references aren't there to flatter cinephiles, but to show how deeply these characters are shaped by what they've seen. They analyze technique not to score points, but to understand themselves. A dust-off remark about Hawks or Renoir becomes a moment of self-diagnosis, revealing what each filmmaker hopes to emulate or escape. The director captures the delicate instability of early artistic ambition. The characters aren't wrong when they contradict themselves. They're evolving. Their ideals shift after a screening, a failure, and a conversation. The film understands that creative principles are not born but fully formed. They're provisional, vulnerable to revision, and shaped by the unpredictable texture of lived experience. What really stood out, at least in my opinion, is the director's depiction of pressure. Not the dramatic kind, mind you, but the quieter, internal pressure of wondering whether you have the stamina to keep going when brilliance feels perpetually out of reach. The film honors those small private turning points, when someone encourages an idea you were ready to abandon, or when doubt becomes so intense it feels like gravity. Rather than present the new wave as a volcanic eruption, Linklater suggests it grew from these minor tremors, the accumulation of questions, frustrations, and stubborn hopes. The title encourages viewers to see creativity as a continuous negotiation with the past, shaped as much by restlessness as by reverence. Finally, what elevates this title beyond a period study is its resonance with today's cultural landscape. The filmmaker doesn't imitate the French New Wave. He reinterprets its ethos through a modern lens, asking what rule-breaking looks like in a world where innovation is often quantified by engagement metrics and release strategies. As I hinted before, the Netflix connection underscores this tension. Here is a platform frequently criticized for flattening theatrical culture, now serving as the key channel for a film about artists who pushed against rigidity. The filmmaker uses that contradiction to spark a broader reflection on authorship, autonomy, and the strange modern pressure to make art that is instantly classifiable. His stylistic choices are nostalgic decorations. The handheld volleys, jack edits, and casual scene shifts feel like contemporary interpretations of restlessness, the cinematic equivalent of refusing to sit still in a market obsessed with uniformity. They also signal a director engaging with the past without being swallowed by it. By weaving subtle commentary about today's creative landscape, the auteur reframes artistic defiance as an ongoing, evolving practice. Freedom now means refusing to chase formulas disguised as data, refusing to treat the audience as a demographic target rather than a community of individuals, but reneges the retreat into safe replicas of past successes. This thread deepens the film's impact. Nouvelle Vague argues that the spirit of the new wave can't be reduced to its stylistic quirks. It's a mindset, a willingness to dismantle expectations, and to trust instinct before convention. The director positions that spirit squarely in the present, suggesting that every era requires its own version of aesthetic courage. By bridging periods without collapsing them, the film becomes a reminder that the impulse to disrupt, question, and reinvent remains the beating heart of cinematic and overall artistic process. Summing it up, when Nouvelle Vague ends, what lingers isn't the mythos surrounding the French New Wave, but the intimacy of the experience. The chance to sit beside these young artists before history hardened around their names. Linklater doesn't glorify their trajectory. He reveals the uncertainties that shaped it. The title succeeds because it treats the past not as an artifact but as a living reminder of how renewal begins in conversations, disagreements, experiments, and the courage to abandon the comfortable. In an era obsessed with declaring the death of cinema, Nouvelle Vague offers a gentler, more grounded perspective. Creativity persists because people continue to challenge what feels fixed. Thoughtful, warm, and quietly invigorating, the film invites us to see history not as a finished story, but as a dialogue still unfolding.